Hi, everyone. My name is Barbara Slavin. I direct the Future of Iran initiative here at the Atlantic Council. Let me begin by wishing everyone the best Nowruz possible under the circumstances. It's been a hard year for all of us, but especially for the people of Iran. And I hope that the future for Iran is brighter, and I hope that perhaps there can be some relaxation of tensions between the United States and Iran. Now, Iran, as you know, uses an ancient solar calendar. And according to that calendar, this year's spring solstice will mark the beginning of the year 1400, a new century. So we thought this would be a good time to look back and look forward. It's fair to say that the past century has been incredibly tumultuous for Iran, with significant triumphs and also significant setbacks. Iran's long quest for independence from foreign powers, for development and prosperity, and for a more representative and humane form of government has certainly made progress at times, but it's also been stymied frequently by Iranians themselves, although sometimes with foreign countries playing a rather mixed role. So we put together what I think is a really fantastic panel of Iranians to talk about their country as it marks this turning point, inflection point, as we like to say at the Atlantic Council. And I also invite everyone to go to our Iran Source blog, where we have 3 pieces on this topic, 2 of them by Nader Shamlu and Sina Azodi, who will be speaking today. There's also one by Borzoy Daragahi, who's another non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. And finally, there's a piece by Shal Bakash, one of Iran's great historians and the author of an excellent new book on the life of Reza Shah in exile. So we're going to start with Nader Shamlu, who, as I mentioned, is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and she's also a former World Bank official and development expert. And this whole event, frankly, was Nader's idea. After Nader, we're going to go to someone who is new for us here at the Council, but someone I've admired from afar for a very long time. And that's Sadegh Zibakalam, a professor at the University of Tehran, who is joining us from Iran with connections, hopefully still good. He has written and spoken quite thoughtfully and often critically about events in his country. And we're looking forward to his remarks. Then Sina Azodi, a non-resident fellow at the Council and a frequent contributor to our blog, for his reflections as a millennial who was raised in Iran and came here as a young man. And finally, an old and dear friend and a stellar analyst of Iranian politics, Mirzad Boroujerdi, who directs the School of Public and International Affairs at Virginia Tech. I got to know him when he was a professor of political science at Syracuse University's Maxwell School, and he's written a number of fabulous books and edited books on Iran, including most recently, Post-Revolutionary Iran, a Political Handbook. So Nader, it's over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Barbara, for this kind introduction and also for hosting this event at the Atlantic Council. I think that it is my great pleasure and honor to be on this panel. And without much ado, let me just throw out a few ideas, and I hope that the other panelists, the other esteemed panelists that I have the pleasure to be on, will either react or contradict or maybe even, propose their own ideas. Earlier today, as you mentioned, one of my blogs was posted on the Atlantic Council, where I kind of compare the challenges Iran faces today with the challenges that Iran faced a century ago. Of course, the country is a very different country. Back then in early, in 1920s or the year 1300, Iran was had about a population of about 5 million, of which about, let's say less than 5% were literate and about 90% were rural, very little urban population. There was a big poverty and so on. And today, of course, Iran has about 85 million, with another 5 million supposedly Iranian diaspora across the world. The younger generation of Iranians have about 98% literacy, and of course, Iran is a much richer country today. But I think that some of the challenges that we faced back then are still around, and I would like to categorize them into three formidable challenges and one super challenge that I will explain right now. Well, the first formidable challenge is, of course, about government or governance. Um, as many of you may know, the constitutional revolution of 1906 and 1911 was a very aspirational piece. But nonetheless, it had, its purpose was to essentially balance the power between, or take it away from the court or from the king and vest it into the parliament. But in between the position of the executive, that means the government, the ministers, the prime minister, was not well defined according to the constitution. The king had the power to appoint and dismiss prime ministers, but so did also the Majlis. And so there was this revolving door government, and in the end, the government was not neither representative because it was an appointed government, nor was it a very effective government. Today, we face something slightly, it's slightly different, but still the same problem in the sense that, okay, today the government, the presidency, and the ministers, the cabinet, the president is elected by the people, but his role and also his powers and his accountability is not well defined because it is being undermined or overshadowed or whatever we may want to call it by non-elected bodies. And in the end, again, Iranian people don't have as much of a say in the kind of policies or in the kind of, or they have marginal say in the kind of policies that the government can pursue. So again, we still are still at the stage where we need to kind of have a representative government that comes to power or is dismissed by the people for the people, and we still are still struggling with that. The second challenge that I see is economic security and economic inclusion. Again, back then, Iran was a very poor country, largely agrarian, with the exception of a very thin layer of the oil industry. And again, it was a very thin layer of the oil industry. The rest was very agrarian, and there was this vast income inequality, with the exception of the aristocracy and some elite. The rest of the country lived in almost absolute poverty. Today, Iran, of course, is a richer country, but and the middle class has grown, but still there is a big perceived, if not even real, but perceived income inequality. People see a vast class differences, and there is a perception, although there is absolute poverty is still there, but it's much more to a much lower degree or much lower share, but still there is a large degree of relative poverty. So we still have to work on the issue of greater inclusion of everyone in the economy and a better distribution of Iran's wealth among its people. The third challenge that I see is that back then in the 1920s, in the beginning of the century, we were at loggerheads with two superpowers, with Russia, or although to a decreasing degree because of the Bolshevik Revolution, but still with Russia and with the UK. Our policies, internal politics were more or less structured or being influenced by the effort to balance these two powers. Today, we are still at loggerheads with another superpower, and even though we are trying, even though there is a kind of the slogan that we have more istiqlal, we have more independence, but we are still trying to balance the negative or the whatever the effects of the United States or our confrontation with the United States. Fortunately, it still is a cold confrontation, not yet, or hopefully never a warm confrontation, but we are trying to balance that confrontation with other superpowers, China, Russia, recently even India, to kind of balance this, and this kind of um, struggle is still there. And then, just to be very brief, then I come to the superpower, a super challenge of all, which is the inclusion of women and minorities in the Iranian society. In the year 1300, women and religious minorities were second-class citizens. Even the constitutional revolution was essentially for Shia men. And today, even 100 years later, even though in between, we had a huge push to kind of gain more and more of an equal status with men in the society. But today, and particularly since yesterday was the International Women's Day, I have the right and the legitimacy to say that even today we are still struggling for that, and we still are far from being equal citizens with men. To me, it seems that the Islamic Republic, the policies of the Islamic Republic, or the polity of the Islamic Republic, is likely to resolve maybe the other challenges, the governance or the economic or even the foreign relations challenge. The issue with the inclusion of women or inclusion of other minorities, which, if you can count them all together, would be the majority of the Iranians, because 50% of women, plus of course the other percentages, it's an ideological hindrance or ideological issue that the Islamic Republic would have a very big difficulty to get over. So this is what I call the mother of all challenges that we still have to overcome. And with that, I would like to give the floor back to you, Barbara, and to the other esteemed panelists to, have their views on the challenges we face now.
Thank you, Nowruz. That's a perfect way to set up the conversation. Now, if he's still with us, Professor Ziba Kalam, we would love to have your thoughts. One of the things that our blogs have focused on is the status of the middle class in Iran and how it has changed over the years and how important that is to the future of the country. So please, the floor is yours. Bafame.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I am honored to be on this panel. I sincerely thank Atlantic Council for providing me with this panel. I also wish all Iranians the new year, which, as Barbara said it correctly, it's the new century, 15th century for Iranians. I like to begin by saying that the beginning of the last century was a struggle for modernization, for political development, and above all for democracy. It manifested itself in the constitutional revolution, more or less at the beginning of the 14th century. And the most important goal of the constitutional revolution was a kind of democratic form of government, a government not according to the rule of the ruler, king, president, or whoever, but by the law. Now, for a host of reasons, the constitutional revolution did not materialize very much, and the Iranian did not experience, did not observe the fruit of the constitutional revolution, which was a form of democratic government. Much of the 14th century Iran, in my opinion, Barbara, has been struggle for democracy. After the fall of the Reza Shah after the Second World War, nearly, or rather 2 years before the end of the Second World War, there was 12 years of a kind of democratic atmosphere in Iran. Unfortunately, by the coup in 1953, Dr. Mossadegh's liberal government was overthrown, and for 25 years, Iran was ruled under a very dictatorial style of government by the late Shah. Although we progress in economy and in social maybe in social progress during Mohammad Reza Shah, but as far as political development, as far as a form of democratic government was concerned, unfortunately, in the words of Amnesty International, Shah's government was one of the worst as far as the human right was concerned. Iran had one of the highest political prisoner under the Shah, and many other features which were incompatible to a democratic form of government. In my opinion, the Islamic Revolution was actually for a better form of government, for a more democratic form of government. It was to have a free election, not to have political prisoners, to have press freedom, etc., etc. Unfortunately, for reasons which I hope the Atlantic Council will hold another session like this. The object of the Islamic Revolution were overrun by a very radical ideas, anti-Americanism, the call to destroy a state of Israel, to export the Iranian Revolution, anti-Westernization, etc., etc. These objects, these goals became very powerful, and as I said, they overrun the democratic object of the Islamic Revolution. You could say that the struggle for democracy continued under the 8 years of we had then the 8 years of reform president Mr. Khatami, and I believe that we are in the last days of the 14th century. It would be no exaggeration, Barbara, to say that we entered the 14th century with the struggle for democracy in Iran, and we are ending that century. Still, we are struggling for democracy and democratic values in Iran. As far as challenges are concerned, in my opinion, Iran is facing three fundamental challenges. I call it ethnical division. The country is deep rooted in ethnicity, and there hasn't been any political development to modify the call for ethnicity. When the revolution happened 42 years ago, Barbara, we had one ethnic group which challenged the central government, the courts. Unfortunately, after 42 years, it's not the court alone. We had Azeris, we had Sunnis, Baluchis, Arab. Because, as I said, because of due to the lack of political development, unfortunately, ethnicity has become a fundamental problem in today's Iran. The second division, the second crisis, the second problem is the economic problem. In my opinion, the wealth division, Gini coefficient of economy, unfortunately, has deteriorated. The rich has become richer in Iran during the past 42 years. The poor has become much poorer in Iran again during the past 42 years. And in my opinion, the third division, the third threat is what I call cultural division, cultural contradiction, which Iran would be facing dangerously in future. The division between the religious Iranian, who are very religious and they are ready, that they are prepared to do anything for the Islamic government, and in sharp contrast to religious Iranian, you have other Iranian, the more educated Iranian, who are completely, as I said, irreligious. They have become irreligious as a result of the performance of the Islamic regime. So these three threats, these three division, ethnic division, economic division, and cultural division, they are the pitfall. They are the danger of Iran as Iran would enter into 15th centuries in more or less 10 days time. And in my opinion, the remedy for all these the problems is political development and democracy. I again thank you for having me on your program.
Thank you so much. I should tell people that we have a Q&A function. I see some people are starting to put their questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So please do and say whether there is a question for a specific person. We will get to that. Professor Ziba Kalam, I have to ask you one follow-up, and that is, of course, we at the Atlantic Council and me as an American and non-Iranian obsess about US policy and the impact of our policies on Iran. Is it fundamentally a question of US policy at all? Or is this really something that Iranians have to wrestle with themselves?
Unfortunately, as I said, Barbara, unfortunately, anti-Americanism, which was a legacy of the left, Marxist left in Iran, it was transformed very much to they inherited the fundamentalist, the Islamic radical, if you like. They inherited much of the leftist ideology and anti-Americanism or American imperialism, which was a big motto in Iran during the revolution by the Marxists. The currents in Iran, unfortunately, was inherited by the Islamists.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Sina Azodi, who lived in Iran as a child and a teenager. You're a child of the Iran-Iraq War, really. Yes. And wanted to ask you, and this kind of flows from the discussion of anti-Americanism, the ideological component of the Islamic Republic, which the notions of grandeur, the notions of empire, which the Islamic Republic inherited from the Shah, but gave a different twist and gave an ideological and a religious twist. If you could talk to that a little bit and where you see that going. Is there any counterbalance to that now that we're seeing from the region, particularly as we see more and more Arab countries openly recognize the state of Israel?
Thank you, Barbara, for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. On your question, I really think that this anti-imperialism, which has presented itself in the context of the revolution's anti-Americanism, it goes back to the experiences of the 20th century, where some of the challenges, as Nader mentioned, was to really how to deal with the great powers of the time. One of the important challenges that Iranians faced in the 20th century was how to deal with the great powers who, for the sake of their own interests, sacrificed or really stole Iranian resources. For example, in 1907, the Anglo-Russian Treaty of basically which they carved up Iran, the nationalization of oil. All of these, they present themselves in the context of independence and cutting off foreign hands from Iran. Early in the 20th century, you see the United States being the benevolent power, and as a counterbalance to the Brits and to the Russians, who were, as I mentioned, ripping off Iran of its resources, or as some put it, sucking off the blood of Persia. Now, that transformed after the 1953 coup, where United States replaced Great Britain as a dominant power. So the anti-American aspect of the Islamic Revolution, which, as I said, was in the broader context of being anti-imperialism, anti-great powers, it was, in a sense, in a response to the question of independence and Iran's yearning for standing on its own feet. Many in Iran back then believed that if we cut off foreign hands, if we push the foreigners out of Iran, we can have a prosperous country. We are not prosperous, we are not independent, because foreign powers are in our country. That, as I said, presented itself in the revolution, in the ideological aspect of the revolution, that the United States was now the enemy. The years of the Shah and human rights abuses of the time was the product of the United States and its interference in Iranian affairs. And again, this has nothing to do with the United States itself. It really has to do with the Iranian mindset that we need to push the foreigners out of Iran to be able to prosper.
And this of course during the after the revolution, I mean during the Iran-Iraq War even, you know, it morphed into a desire to spread the, if not the system, then aspects of the system, certainly to Arabs, in particular Shia Arabs around Iran and in the Middle East, beginning with Hezbollah and so on. Where do you see that going, this expansionist instinct in Iran, which has caused, of course, a lot of consternation, particularly among Arabs, and faced a lot of pushback?
I think this has to do with really how Iran views itself and the region. And I really like to mention that, as many know, Iran, for much of its history, has been an imperial state, and it identifies itself with its imperial achievements. Now, that empire has ceased to exist, but Iranian rulers, be it the Shah, be it the clerical leaders, they still view Iran as an imperial state and act accordingly. Now, does Iran have the power and the capability to act as an empire? No, obviously not, but it still behaves like one. And that is why you see Saudi officials, and I think it was the former foreign minister Adel al-Jubeir, who said that that Tehran wants to reestablish the Safavid empire. Now, this shows how the Arab leaders view Tehran and how Tehran is still behaving. So my understanding is that in the next century, you will still see that Iran behaving like an imperial state, which, because of its history, views itself as a natural hegemon of the region and a country that has to be recognized as a very important player. Now, from what I've seen in the past 10 years, is that every time great powers, and namely the United States, they go to Iran and ask for assistance, they don't usually turn them down. They provide assistance, especially after the 9/11, or on ISIS. But every time Iran has been excluded from regional calculations, Iranians have made it very clear that they are the players in the region. And there are many examples when, for example, when the United States excluded Iran from the conference in Spain on the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian peace, Iranians escalated their interference in the peace process, just to make the point that we are an important player and you cannot have stability in the region without Tehran. Now, I believe this is a true statement. You cannot have peace and stability without Iran. But at the same time, I believe that Iran cannot have peace and stability and prosperity without the region, without the major Arab countries of the region.
All right, thank you. Let me turn now to Mirzad, who has followed very closely the political and intellectual trends that we've seen in Iran, particularly since the revolution. My first visit to Iran was in 1996, just at the beginning of the reform period, when there was a lot of optimism that Iran could somehow take this unwieldy system of Velayat Faqih and turn it into something that was more representative of popular opinion. But we all know how it turned out. So Mirzad, over to you.
Well, thank you, Barbara, and the Atlantic Council for this opportunity to be with you here. I would like to paint with a broad brush some of the enduring political and intellectual trends that we have seen in the 20th and 21st century, and talk about some of the similarities and differences. So broadly speaking, when we look at Iran's history, we know that for much of its history, Persian artists, literati, philosophers, they have had to deal with two types of censorship. One was the absolutism of the state, and the other was the fanaticism of puritanical clerics. And in that sense, unfortunately, not much has changed. When we look at the history of Iran in the 20th century, what we see is that the last century basically testifies to the fact that still the Iranians are advocating for such things as freedom, rule of law, limits on the power of rulers and clerics alike, are struggling against the two twin problems of foreign interference and domestic despotism. And in my view, neither one is less significant than the other. And diminishing the importance of one really leads us to not understand Iran properly. When you look at the discourse today in Iran, people are still criticizing the state for what? For authoritarianism, censorship, nepotism, fanaticism, influence peddling, partisanship, violence. What are they demanding? Accountability, civil rights, democracy, limited state, social justice, tolerance, transparency, a fair legal system, and things of that sort. So one can say, broadly speaking, there is a lot that remains the same, regardless of how things have changed. We are still, whether you are a secular or a religious Iranian, it seems that the memory of a resplendent past still is captivating, right? The hedonistic and mystical, Gnostic Persian poetry remains unrivaled in terms of its popular appeal, no matter what. For the secular nationalists of Iran, as was the case in the early 1900s, it is still the case. Islam and Arabs remain as favorite targets of criticism. So not much has changed in terms of that discourse. We are still predominantly, our intellectuals are still predominantly talking about notions of qualified assimilation of the West, that we don't want to be apishly imitating everything that comes from the West, but rather we want to be selectively choosing, right? Those qualities that might lend themselves to acculturation into the Iranian type of context. We are still worried about the outside world. A century ago, right? Radio, cinema, cars, tape recorders, and oil burst on us suddenly. And nowadays it's the internet, the cell phone, and Facebook and everything else, and the problems that those have brought with them as before. Then, as well as now, some of the most important intellectual works in Iran are being done outside the country, which I think is quite interesting among expats. But there are also big differences, I think, compared to the past. Unfortunately, I must say, the superb intellectual statesmen of a century ago that we used to have are nowhere to be found. The current cadre of leaders in Iran, in my view, are jokes compared to the men of the caliber of Zokal Mulk Furughi or Tagizadeh or others like that. Very poor imitations. By the same token, intellectuals no longer have that respected, are no longer viewed as that respected reference group that they used to be, right? They are competing for attention with all sorts of other celebrities that are out there. Again, understandable as far as how Iran's educational scene has really been altered over the years. There are differences, as Nader pointed out. We have gone from a few hundred Iranians, living outside the country to millions now, right? And that type of intellectual intercourse that goes in between folks outside and inside the country, I think has been fundamentally significant in this regard. As far as the 79 revolution, I think it's fair to say that the profound economic, cultural, social, political transformation that the revolution brought with it has endowed Iranian politics with a degree of sophistication and multidimensionality that was previously unimaginable, right? This is a much more sophisticated citizenry. The intellectual classes are much more acclimated with ideas, concepts that have originated from outside the country. Discussions of identity, power, legitimacy, minorities are much more sophisticated now compared to what there was. We now have female novelists, journalists, authors, poets, directors, cinematographers that have burst on the scene and are influencing things. So a lot has also changed despite all the changes. And one other important factor, I think, which we should not lose sight of, is that with the 79 revolution, the clerical establishment, and in my view, Shiite jurisprudence, became ambushed by politics and became entrapped in the epistemological labyrinth of modernity. Clerics became state functionaries, and therefore the criticism that is levied against state functionaries everywhere now included this esteemed class of clerics. So if you ask me what lessons have we learned, I will say the following. As the saying goes, judgment comes from experience and experience comes from bad judgments. And boy, have we made bad judgments over the last a century. I'm reminded of the famous saying that experience is a good teacher, but her fees are very high. And apparently we have paid really high fees in this regard. Transition from monarchy to the republic did not say goodbye to authoritarianism. Alice, that's what happened. Nativism, which I have written about, in terms of an idea, did not become the panacea for our problems. To cherish what is authentic and indigenous basically meant, we had other types of problems to deal with. Revolution did not bring economic prosperity or individual freedoms with it, right? And therefore, a theocratic state, many argue, has really failed miserably as it turned religion into an ideology with all its shortcomings. So in the interest of time, let me conclude by saying that, I want to be hopeful, right? As they say, hope is the only capital of the unfortunate. And one would hope that with Iran's, educated, urban and young population, one can be, hopeful. But in this day and age, I find myself, frankly, more in agreement with the dejected tone of the following short poem by one of Iran's leading literary scholars, Dr. Shafiei Katkani. This is the poem. A child named Happiness has long vanished. She has perky eyes and hair as long as my dreams. Whoever knows anything about her whereabouts, let us know. Here is our address: Persian Gulf to our south, Caspian to our north, right? That's I think Shafiei Katkani has nicely summed up how I feel this in this day and age.
Indeed.
Thank you.
That was lovely. We have about 20 minutes left. I'm going to go to some of your questions now. And I have one. This is from an anonymous attendee for Dr. Ziba Kalam. Do you believe the Islamic regime has the capacity to go back to the core objections of the revolution? Remember, this was fought not just for independence, but also to raise the downtrodden and to make Iran a more equal society. Over to you. You're muted. You have to unmute. There you go.
Do you have my voice now?
Yes.
Yeah, it's one of the deepest and hugely important discussion amongst Iranians. The question is, Barbara, to put the question very simply, Barbara, is that is the Islamic regime capable of reform, or no, it isn't capable of reform? Obviously, the many younger generation, the Iranians, many Iranian expatriates who live outside the country, royalists, etc., they say no, but this regime is not capable of carrying out any reform. Therefore, there must be a revolution. The Islamic regime must be overthrown. In my opinion, the question is not whether or not the regime is capable of being reformed. We must force it to reform. This is the job of Iranian intellectual, of Iranian reformists, and of Iranian writers, etc., because to overthrow the Islamic regime, the whole country would go backward. Those divisions that I mentioned during my talk will destroy Iran. Iran would become worse than Iraq. Iran would become worse than Syria. Iran would become worse than Afghanistan. And those divisions that Barbara I mentioned, if the central government for any reason is overthrown, I really don't think that anything would be left of Iran. Therefore, for the sake of Iran itself, we must try to reform the existing Islamic government, the existing Islamic establishment by reform. We have no other option.
That is extremely well said. You have mentioned the divisions. I'm going to go to Nowruz. We have a question about religious minorities, and as we know, the Iranian state recognizes Shia Islam and Sunni Islam and Judaism and Christianity, although with limitations. But there's a question here about Baha'is, and if you could speak a little bit to the religious groups that have also faced a great deal of oppression under the Islamic Republic, and whether this can possibly change and we can see more tolerance for these groups.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara. I think that the religious minorities, in a way, into the same category as women, in the sense that they're all second-class citizens. But then there are some who are more equal than others in terms of their second-class citizenship. And the Baha'is are probably among those who fit into the last category. Yes, unfortunately, despite the fact that under the constitution, under the Iranian constitution of today, every citizen is supposed to be equal. But then there are all of these shades of, unfortunately, all of these shades of qualifications that put some citizens behind others. I wanted just to, if I can take maybe 1 minute to maybe react to some of the points that were made by some of the other speakers. I fully agree that we now have at a point in time where we have to do some introspection. 2 points come to my mind. One is that we have been in this last century, or maybe even more than that, maybe 150 years, we have blamed our problems and our own shortcomings on foreign powers. We are like this because the British people were, the British government wanted us to do this. We had high, let's say, levels of corruption because of the Americans. We had this, that. Now, after the revolution, one of the things that we can talk about, it's a good counterfactual in the sense that we do see that despite the foreign powers, we have corruption in Iran. So we have to do something about this within our own society. We have a lot of other problems that we used to blame on foreign powers, which persist after the revolution, after the Islamic Revolution, which have nothing to do with foreign powers. So we have to really do some introspection by ourselves. The second point that I want to make is that we often compare today with 42 years ago of before the revolution. Again, I think that that's the wrong comparison, because in many countries 42 years ago, whatever those countries were, is very different than what those countries are today. Let's take Korea, for instance, or let's even take Turkey, that is next door to us. We see that the countries have progressed continuously. If we really want to compare Iran, we should no longer compare Iran to 42 years ago before the revolution. That is the wrong counterfactual. We need to compare Iran of before the revolution, during, before the Pahlavis, after the Pahlavis, during the Pahlavis, to countries that were then Iran's comparators or peers, and we need to compare today Iran with those countries. And one thing that I would like to add is that, just I'm coming back to economics. In the Middle East right now, Saudi Arabia and Turkey are ahead of Iran in terms of their, the ranking of their GDPs, in terms of the size of the GDPs. Turkey, because of its 85 million people, of population, and of course an economy that is very diversified and not based on oil. And Saudi Arabia is ranking, I think it's 16th or 17th in the world, right behind Turkey, basically because of the size of its oil reserves and its oil industry. Now, can you imagine where Iran could have been and what sort of benefits Iran could have had for its population if we could have combined the $85 million population together with our power as a second or third largest oil country, both in terms of ability to produce as well as reserves. So I think that the fact that we are now today number 30 or something close to that tells me that we have far underperformed compared to where we could have been and where we should have been, just basically because we are not taking care, or we are not looking at our own shortcomings and blaming other issues and other people and other countries for our own mistakes. And hopefully those will be some of the judgments and experiences that we can use for the next century.
Sina, let me come back to you as our representative of the millennials. Something about the rise and fall of hopes in Iran. I think we were talking before, and you said that you voted once, and that was in 2001 for Mohammad Khatami.
Yes.
That experience, has it disillusioned people permanently? I mean, we certainly saw 2009, people came out massively after that election when Ahmadinejad took it from Mousavi. And I also have a question in the Q&A, if you could address about the problem of addiction in Iran. And I think this may not just be millennials, it may be throughout the society, but this is certainly narcotics addiction has certainly become a huge problem for the Iranian society. So I'll put that one at your door too.
Okay, I'll try that one too. So when it comes to the hopes of the reform, I do remember when Khatami came to power. I was very young, but I remember parents, everybody, people around me were very hopeful that Khatami, with his smile, has come to power. his outreach to the United States, his famous interview with the CNN, which for the first time an Iranian official, the second highest Iranian official, had admitted to the wrongdoing of the hostage taking in 1979. He did not apologize, but he got as close as he could in apologizing. So a lot of people were hopeful. I remember my parents, my relatives, friends talking, and many were hopeful that things will change. I remember sitting in a class and our teacher said, let's vote. Hopefully we can change things in the country. And Khatami tried, but failed really. Some because of domestic pushback from the hardliners, and some of it, I would say, his unfortunate luck. And the terrorist attacks of 9/11 changed everything. Iran did distance itself from 9/11. It did cooperate with the United States, but again, the Khatami's unfortunate luck. It was the time where the American hardliners, the neocons, were in power, and the infamous axis of evil. It really changed everything in Iran. And the hopes of maybe improving relations with the United States, I think, were shattered back then. And again, I do not, this was not either Khatami's fault or anybody's fault. It was rather the unfortunate or tragic cycle of events or presidential cycles in Iran and the United States, where when there's an administration in the United States which tries to approach Iran with a gesture of cooperation or friendship, rather, Iranians push back. And when the time changes, Iranians are ready to engage with the United States, as it happened during Khatami. The administration in Washington is not really ready to engage with Iran. So yes, the hopes of improving relations with the United States were shattered. Now, this has nothing to do with domestic affairs, that the hardliners in Iran pushed back against Khatami and his reforms. But these two factors, I believe, really diminished the hopes of making fundamental changes. Yes, I remember newspapers, the judiciary would shut down one newspaper, and then, the Ministry of Culture would issue another license to the staff of the same newspaper, and they would go start a new one. Things like that did happen. Society did change. The coverage of women in the streets changed substantially. Even, again, as a 17, 18-year-old kid, I could recognize that things have been changing. But as I said, again, there was a pushback from the inside, and there was a rather unfortunate settling of events between Iran and the United States, which neither was Washington's fault, neither Tehran's. It was rather unfortunate. Now, on drug addiction, I am not expert on an issue. I'll just tell you my thoughts on that. I think setting aside the issue of opium and traditional addiction problems that have long existed in Iran, the surge in rather modern narcotics in Iran has to do with the younger generation trying to mimic what's happening in the West. They throw parties. Fortunately, I've never attended one of those, but I've heard that there's so many drugs available and cheap, and people just use them.
Yeah. Well, it's not a problem just in Iran, I'm afraid. As we well know. We're almost out of time, so I'm going to give both Mirzad and Professor Ziba Kalam the last word. The question is, how do you promote reform in Iran? I mean, if we agree that that violent regime change is not the answer, and certainly foreign intervention is not the answer, how do you do it? And so Mirzad, maybe a couple of words, and then we'll leave the last word to Professor Ziba Kalam. Mirzad, yeah. You with us, Mirzad? Have we lost you?
He's mute.
Sorry, do you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, sorry.
I would do it.
I think that this is the million-dollar question, right? Whether this theocratic regime has the capacity for reform. You know, if you want to take the pessimistic outlook, one can say, well, you know, let's look at the track record. I mean, we have been talking about Mr. Khatami and others since 1997. But show me, where have the reformists made any inroads in challenging the authority of the supreme leader, in making the judiciary more accountable, in making the IRGC, Revolutionary Guards, more transparent in terms of their hidden economies, etc. Unfortunately, the answer to all those questions is that they have failed miserably, right? In other words, that the regime has no interest in power sharing, in becoming more transparent, in reforming itself, right? So here, I think the burden, we cannot be challenging the people who are dissatisfied with the state. If the state is remaining irresponsible, right, and doesn't answer to popular demands, what do you expect? First of all, what happens in the first stage is the loss of legitimacy, right? And I think, again, we will be living in loony world if we do not want to acknowledge the legitimacy problem of the Islamic State. That's number one. Second is, where is the boiling point? And do you understand, where that red line is if you are, a statesman, right? Again, I think here, going back to the point I was making before, unfortunately, I do not see among the Iranian elite people of the caliber, right, who could recognize where that boiling point is. So, regardless of what I want or Dr. Ziba Kalam wants, et cetera, I think we need to embrace ourselves that the present course can lead to more trouble down the road, if not a revolution, but long series of popular uprisings. As we have seen, the frequency of those protests has been up. Last 3 years, every single year there has been an occasion for people to come out, in thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, right? So I think the regime is also responsible for preventing us from reaching that point of no return.
Dr. Zibkam, if you could comment, and also if you have any thoughts on the upcoming presidential election in Iran. Is it meaningless? Iran does have politics. What should we expect?
Barbara, the majority of the social classes who tend to support, have tended to support reformists in the past, because of the horrible experience that we had with President Rouhani, will not take part in the upcoming election, which would be in about 4 months' time from now. It means that, in other words, the 24 million people who voted 4 years ago, nearly 4 years ago, for Mr. Rouhani, many of them would not take part in the coming election. That leaves the room open for the supporter of the hardliner, whom with the tiny minority would actually will have the new president in Iran in about 4 or 5 months time from now. Now that means that all the power, the judiciary, the parliament, Iranian Majlis, legislative, and the presidential the power would be at the hand of the hardliners. Now, many reformists say that actually it's not such a bad scenario, because at the moment, all the decisions, all the important decisions, all the principal decisions, be it in international relations, domestic economy, etc., is actually taken by the hardliners, but they are not responsible. They are not accountable to all these the decisions that they are making. Who is accountable? Mr. Rouhani is accountable. And many reformists are saying that let us have a radical, a hardliner as the president, so that the hardliner for the first time have to answer to people. They must be accountable, because at the moment they do, as I said, they do everything and they are not accountable for it. So in my opinion, the next president would be a hardliner. He might be from Revolutionary Guard, he might be from the civilian section of the hardliner. It doesn't matter. He would be a hardliner. Now, as to the question of the past experience, as Mr. Dr. Brujerdi said, that the past experience has proved that the Islamic regime is incapable of developing towards a more accountable government. Barbara, the point is that everyone, like Dr. they all criticize, and rightly they say that this is the first fault, this is the second fault. In the economy, the Islamic regime has done so badly. In foreign relation, international relation, it has failed, etc., etc. But they don't give you any solution, any alternative. What is to be done? What should we do? Should we go towards the overthrow of the Islamic regime, which I told you would be ruin, not for the Islamic regime, but for Iran? Or should we try to reform from within the state? The problem with Dr. Brujerdi and many Iranians is that they have given up any hope of the fact that this regime is capable of any reform. As long as we are confronted with this idea that the Islamic regime is not capable of carrying out any reform in that regime, obviously we would not be able to progress. So the first point would be to believe that this regime is capable of undertaking political reform.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. It's spring, it's going to be Nowruz, and we have to be hopeful, especially after the horrible year that the whole world has been through. I could carry on this conversation all day, but unfortunately, we have to stop here. Let me thank so much everyone who's participated, and particularly Professor Reza Khan. I hope we will be able to have you back for other conversations, and I hope I'll get to meet you someday in person if I ever get a visa to go back to Iran. Thank you all so much.
Inshallah.
Be well and be safe, everyone.
And Happy New Year to all. Happy
New Year. Yes, thank you.
Khudahafiz hamegi. Khudahafiz. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you. That was great, guys. Thank you.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thanks, Barbara.